Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a stack of your notes and excerpts here. Really captures a snapshot of recent news, recent discussions.
It does. And while, yes, a lot focuses on the Netherlands, the threads you've pulled really do stretch, well, everywhere, across the globe.
Absolutely. So our mission today, really, is to dive into all this material you've shared. We want to try and pull out the core insights, maybe connect some dots between topics that seem unrelated at first glance.
Yeah, help cut through the noise a bit.
Exactly. Give you that shortcut to getting well informed on what's actually going on.
And it's about seeing the bigger patterns, isn't it, behind the headlines, whether it's government spending or the challenges businesses are facing or these big shifts in, say, global health talks.
Or even your pension. That's in there too.
Right, that too.
Okay, so let's start with something from your sources that actually has a bit of positive energy. A nice moment, really. It's the story of Roger Llewellyn.
Ah, yes, winning that P3DX Innovation Challenge. TNO highlighted that back in January 2025.
What makes his story, well, particularly relevant based on your material is the backstory, isn't it? The journey he took.
It is. The sources detail how he started scrutinizing PCR tests way back in 2019, then the pressure during COVID, obviously.
hmm And his refusal to vaccinate, which led to him being dismissed from Erasmus Hospital, it's all laid out.
But despite all that, the notes mention his eventual rehabilitation, and now winning this significant research funding, it's quite something.
It really feels like a personal triumph against, well, a lot of adversity.
Exactly, and maybe a positive signal that persistence, dedication to the science, it can eventually get recognized, even when facing big institutional hurdles. A bit of resilience.
A glimmer, yeah. Okay, so from that personal story, let's zoom out. The Dutch business climate. Your sources paint a picture that looks, well, maybe like stormy seas for some sectors.
Seems that way. You've got the Axo Nobel News and their closing factories, Wapenveld here in Gelderland, and Magellan over in Belgium. That's, 276 jobs affected?
And it wasn't just out of the blue for them, right? The sources say this followed other closures. Africa, Europe, reorganizations in France, too.
Yeah, it's presented as part of a bigger picture for the company. Their stated reason is improving operations, reducing complexity. Standard corporate language, perhaps.
But your notes dig deeper, offering different takes on why companies like Exo might be doing this.
Right. Multiple perspectives. One is, well, it's just capitalism, isn't it? The drive for scale, efficiency, which often means moving production to lower wage countries.
Okay, that's one view. What else?
Another angle points fingers specifically at the Netherlands, or Europe more broadly, things like high regulation, the tax burden, and this perceived difficulty in innovating quickly compared to, say, China. China's mentioned as innovating fast, handling energy differently. There's even a worry voiced in the notes that the Netherlands could, become poor relative to others.
Wow. So the idea is Europe is just not the place to be for new tech like AI, robotization.
That's one strong sentiment expressed, yes. But then there's a counterpoint suggesting it's also partly the companies themselves, their globalistic attitude.
Okay. It's not just external factors.
And you've also got that conversation with Kirk Kierpenstein mentioned about creative Dutch manufacturers who are thriving. So it's not all doom and gloom on the ground.
Right, a counterexample.
But
But the overall feeling from the sources seems to be one of pain, concern about companies leaving.
definitely. And practical things are mentioned too, like energy costs, both the price and, crucially, the stability of supply. That's a big one.
But here's where it gets interesting. There's a counterpoint in your material that feels quite significant.
Ah, you mean the ASML example, Project Beethoven.
Exactly, around Eindhoven. That's highlighted as a positive signal. The government actively stepping in to support a major successful company.
Yeah, and that does suggest maybe a shift, albeit maybe a slow one, in government thinking towards actually backing key players, fostering growth here.
Which is a perfect transition, actually, to looking more broadly at the system itself. Using those Court of Audit reports, the Rechenkammer reports that are cited so heavily in your notes.
Yes, the Rechenkammer. Their job is crucial. Checking if government bodies are effective, hitting their targets, managing public money properly.
And their findings, as presented in your material, they don't seem like isolated incidents, do they? It looks more like a pattern. Systemic challenges.
That's the impression, yeah. Problems highlighted at defense, then justice and security, that detail about checking the books and finding name mix-ups in at least 867 criminal cases. That's pretty startling.
Minimal 867.
Yeah.
Wow. And foreign affairs.
ICT issues there. But the bigger thing is the budget. Huge budget, 11.6, maybe 12 billion euros a year. And the Rechenkamer reportedly says they often don't know where a lot of it goes, especially money for EU cooperation.
Just unclear.
Largely unclear, yes. And education, OCW, isn't spared either. Mention of over 5 billion euros in, well, what are described as missing receipts. The destination of the money just isn't documented properly.
So the overall critique coming out of these reports is pretty sharp.
It seems so. Goals not met, the right conditions aren't in place, huge sums spent without clear accountability or proof they're actually working, raises big questions about effectiveness, doesn't it? Could the money be used better?
Which leads to the next question. Do these Rechenkammer reports, which get into the newspapers, actually change anything?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Your sources seem to connect this lack of real follow-through to a wider crisis of authority.
Like with the Tozlog affair, the child benefit scandal, that's mentioned.
Exactly. A terrible example of where poor communication and coordination between agencies just caused immense suffering. Systemic failure, really.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into that government bureaucracy and spending aspect. The sources suggest it's like this unstoppable force.
Yeah, very hard to rein in. One key point is the number of civil servants keeps going up, even when there were plans to reduce them.
Right, and they're earning more.
On average, yes. Much more than a few years ago, is how one source puts it. Partly due to those mandated CAO increases the collective labor agreements.
So it becomes structurally difficult to cut costs.
Very. You cannot cut against these high costs that are locked in. And the critique also says the government doesn't plan well for this, often ends up hiring expensive external consultants instead, which just adds to the cost.
And that pushes taxes up. The BTW increase is mentioned.
So it puts pressure on, yeah. And the political challenge is, well, stark. Politicians across the board say they want to cut costs, tackle bureaucracy, but it just doesn't succeed.
Even the current coalition had that goal, right?
They did. But making fundamental changes runs into resistance, and political terms are short. The sources suggest you'd need serious turnaround management skills to make a dent.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but still looking at systemic issues. The Dutch universities. And this trend of Anglicization.
Ah, yes. That's a big topic in your notes. The main driver identified is the funding model. It's heavily based on student numbers.
So more students means more money.
Essentially, yes. So smaller universities, Limburg and Twente mentioned, started offering programs in English specifically to attract more foreign students, boost their funding.
And then it just spread.
It spread widely, yeah. Amsterdam, elsewhere. Leading to this huge growth in student numbers, overall 40, maybe 50% increase compared to 10 years ago, students coming from all over Europe and beyond.
And the critical point highlighted is that Dutch taxpayers are largely footing the bill for the EU students.
That's right. Which is then contrasted sharply with the situation for Dutch citizens who want a second degree.
They face a huge fee.
Reportedly 20,000 euros a year, which basically blocks lifelong learning for many Dutch people, unless it's their very first degree or they happen to be under 31, described as discriminatory, effectively.
And does this affect the education itself?
The sources argue yes. Universities hire more foreign lecturers who might be excellent scholars, but, maybe don't fully grasp the Dutch context. The example given is a sociology lecturer unaware of the specific issues Dutch farmers face.
So the education becomes more abstract, detached.
That's the concern. Detached from the local society it's supposed to serve, in a way.
Is there political pushback on this?
Yes, politicians like Omtzigt and Minister Dijkgraaf have proposed things like making bachelor's programs mainly Dutch, maybe 2/3 Dutch, 1/3 English. But it faces a strong lobby, especially from those smaller universities worried about losing students and funding. And because the core issue, the funding system itself, isn't being tackled head-on, like maybe separate funding streams for smaller places, real change might stall.
How does this compare internationally?
Well, the sources mention Spain, where you supposedly need Spanish to study, and Spanish taxpayers aren't funding foreign students like this. Germany, France, Spain are having similar debates, apparently. But the feeling conveyed about the Netherlands is that it's gone completely overboard. The term plafkip is used.
Like a battery hen, grown too fast unnaturally.
Something like that, yeah. Unhealthy growth driven by the system. And Trump's view on Harvard and Chinese students is mentioned as a sort of parallel international discussion about who benefits.
Okay, let's try and connect this idea of abstractness, maybe the focus on management over practical skills in universities, to a broader trend your sources discuss, this loss of craftsmanship.
Yes, it's linked to what's termed the neoliberal revolution,
Mm.
a shift towards seeing everything, economy, society, through a financial lens, focus on individuals as consumers. And this creates a disconnect from practical application, a sort of practice foreignness.
How many examples?
Concerns about Rijkswaterstaat, the infrastructure agency, maybe lacking engineers with enough real hands-on knowledge. There's mention of a book, It Can Wel een Staat, that might argue against this, suggesting expertise still exists. But the general trend described is one of erosion since the 60s and 70s, losing that practical know-how.
And this connects to vocational training, too.
Yes, the disappearance of the old LTS schools is noted, the shift towards everyone wanting to climb the ladder into management. Everyone wants to be a boss, as one source puts it.
Instead of doing the essential hands-on work, like in construction, youth care, laying cables.
Exactly. Which leads to the current difficulty finding skilled tradespeople. Carpenters charging €90 an hour is cited. Just hard to find reliable, skilled workers.
And the point is made that real innovation often combines that practical skill, making things, with organization, not just abstract models.
Precisely. Elon Musk is mentioned again, focusing on production processes, hiring skilled people who can do things. It's about needing that humus layer, as the sources call it.
Foundation.
Yeah, a broad base of young people experimenting, starting businesses, applying skills at all levels, MBO, HBO, academic, not just training managers removed from the practicalities.
Right. Okay, let's shift focus quite dramatically now to international affairs. Your sources flag RFK Jr.'s call for nations to leave the WHO. That's described as best well-breaking news. Pretty significant.
It is. And there's mention of a proposed alternative, the BHA Assembly Biosafety, Health, and Agricultural Assembly, presented as more integral, holistic maybe.
What's the critique of the WHO itself, according to these sources?
Accusations of network corruption, basically. Political and financial interests overriding genuine health concerns and clear information. That's the claim.
And RFK Jr.'s focus is broader than just the WHO.
Yes, it's linked to challenging big food and big pharma. Seeing processed food as a major problem driving poor health in America, even among young people. There's mention of a network of doctors supporting him, looking at the whole chain, food quality, farmers, pesticides like Roundup.
So this is framed as the U.S. may be starting to rethink its international networks, creating alternatives.
That seems to be the interpretation. And the Pfizer-von der Leyen APSHI scandal, or the text message controversy exposed by U.S. journalists, is mentioned in this context too, as an example of issues within the current structures.
Okay, now for a topic that seems particularly complex and controversial in your notes, Trump and South Africa.
Ah, yes. The confrontation with the South African president, showing videos about the situation for white Afrikaners. That definitely sparked debate, as your notes show. Was it unethical? Was it good?
The sources try to unpack the complexity, though. What are the key points?
Well, one factor is South Africa's ties with China and Russia, which the U.S. obviously views critically.
And Elon Musk's background is mentioned?
Yes, his South African roots, the fact he reportedly speaks Afrikaans, possible influence there.
But the sources also stress the reality of violence in South Africa more broadly.
Crucially, yes. Statistically, most murder victims are black, especially in the townships. That figure of 300 murders a week is discussed horrific levels of violence, rape, gang crime in those communities.
So it's not just about one group. But there is also a specific political sentiment mentioned against white wealth.
Yes, particularly farmers, dating back to the 90s. And the EFF Party Economic Freedom Fighters, their slogan, Kill the Boer, is highlighted. Not just a slogan, but an actual song, too.
Described as serious incitement.
Oprahing, yes. Language that your sources say a democracy should suppress. Arrest and punish those responsible. Specific, brutal farm murders are cited as examples, horrific details.
And job discrimination is also mentioned.
Particularly in government jobs, yes. Described as favoring black candidates to the exclusion of others, all and you can't get in as a non-black person.
So Trump's offer to welcome Afrikaners to the U.S., how is that interpreted?
As potentially encouraging a specific kind of migration Christians, likely with pro-U.S. views.
And the overall framing of Trump's action.
As him trying to correct what he sees as skewed or not neutral, challenging the prevailing corrective moral framework around race discussions, both in the U.S. and globally. That's the take presented.
Okay, let's swing back towards Europe, UK politics. Nigel Farage. His movement is described as heading towards a revolution.
That's the strong language used, yes. His strategy, as laid out, is targeting those traditional conservative areas, the counties, by highlighting government failures, failed green projects, money burned, questionable diversity subsidies, and using immigration as a key theme, suggesting everyone's allowed in, drawing parallels with the U.S. situation again.
And this taps into a wider feeling.
Yes, this sense of unrest across Europe, where governments seem focused on foreign policy, like Ukraine, while domestic issues, housing, migration, education, multiculturalism, feel neglected by comparison.
Labor leader Keir Starmer comes in for criticism.
He does, for focusing on Ukraine when the UK has its own problems, and his perceived flirtation with the EU talk of possible reintegration on different terms, seeking benefits that's seen as highly controversial.
And then there's that really striking detail about King Charles.
Yes, implicitly criticizing Starmer's EU stance, described as very rare for the monarch. It's interpreted as the king sensing the country is fundamentally divided, tearing apart along class lines, old aristocracy, new London elite, and then everyone else who feels left out.
So potential for instability there. Farage pushing things.
He's described as poking, not content to wait 5 years for an election, possibly aiming for a quicker populist upheaval, populistische volte.
Other UK issues mentioned.
Briefly, yes. Reports of child sexual exploitation, gangs not being properly addressed, talk of cover-ups within parts of English culture.
Right. Just a quick stop in Romania next, based on your notes. Something about EU influence.
Yeah, the point made is that elections there were reportedly, well, maybe canceled or heavily influenced by Europe to ensure a pro-EU candidate, Iohannis, came out on top.
Specific names mentioned.
Iohannis, yes, and someone called Pavlov, a telegram director, apparently, and a court case that ultimately upheld the result.
Why is Romania seen as important?
Historic ties to France and its strategic role as a transit area for the war against Russia.
So it's presented as another example of
Candidates not wanted by the European establishment potentially being sidelined. That's the narrative in your sources.
Okay, let's turn now to the Ukraine war itself. Your sources point to some significant shifts, or at least perceived shifts.
A key one mentioned is Trump's recent 2-hour call with Putin, described as going well on both sides, according to the material.
And Putin's position.
His peace conditions, apparently laid out since June 2024, haven't changed. He's sticking to them, reportedly.
But there's a shift on the other side.
Well, the perception noted is that Europe and Zelensky are now talking more about a ceasefire. Why? Because the front line is reportedly collapsing. So they're trying to force Russia into a ceasefire from a position of weakness, perhaps.
But Putin's view, as presented, is he has no reason to stop now.
No advantage, exactly. His goals are the same. The only concession mentioned is he'd stop if he gets the 4 oblasts, he claims. Otherwise, the suggestion is he continues potentially making Ukraine, well, unviable as a state. Niet meer levensvatbaar.
And more Western weapons.
Won't change the outcome, is the perspective reiterated in your sources.
Trump's comment about Patriot missile production is mentioned too.
Yes, the U.S. lacking capacity, suggesting Trump sees the practical difficulties, and the idea is Trump doesn't like to lose, so if Russia keeps advancing, he might just withdraw support.
And the U.S. political landscape is shifting too. People like Rubio.
Reportedly moving closer to Trump's view on the war, yes.
So the prediction in your sources is?
That the war might actually end within the next 6 months. A bold prediction.
Very. Okay, this connects back to something we touched on earlier, media narratives, bias. Let's dive into that landscape based on the critiques in your sources.
The Ukraine war is definitely used as a key example here. The narrative in outlets like NRC, Volkskrant, they're mentioned by name, is often described as very one-sided.
How so?
Framed as simple good versus evil. Putin must fall. Ukraine must be fully restored. It's called normative, setting a moral standard rather than just reporting, and often ignoring nuance or diplomatic possibilities.
And the Volkskrant editor, Peter Klock, is mentioned specifically.
Yes. He reportedly admitted making conscious choices about what to publish based on whether it might help populist parties, even though he wants a good newspaper. And he apparently reacted strongly when questioned about dominant narratives on COVID and NATO.
So the general trend described is media becoming more moralistic.
More moralistic, less nuanced, focused on good and bad. And formats getting shorter, schrolled off, becoming leaner, less in-depth, which is then contrasted with platforms like Substack, where you find longer, more detailed pieces.
And the Job Van Sweden case is brought up again as a major example of this. Trial by media.
Trial by media, character assassination, yes. That Pointer documentary about him gets a lot of criticism in your sources.
What kind of criticism?
Accused of deliberately seeking out excesses, maybe even scripting things, presenting him very negatively. The photos chosen showing a monster-like eye-drucking, a monstrous expression, focusing only on critics. Just 10 people, apparently, basically constructing a specific negative image. Angry, power-hungry, belittling.
And the counter-narrative offered.
Is that maybe he's just demanding, passionate, sets incredibly high standards like a driven entrepreneur might. Not necessarily monstrous.
It raises that question about changing standards, doesn't it? What's boundary crossing now versus just being difficult or demanding in the past?
Exactly. The sources float this idea of alles möglich sein. Everything has to be nice. And the weakest link is the measure, suggesting maybe standards get lowered to the most sensitive person.
And the idea that figures like Van Sweden or Matthijs van Nieuwkerk maybe lacked a good support system, a team around them.
Yeah, to help manage the difficult parts of their personalities, that's suggested as a factor in their public downfall.
Khadija Arab's case is mentioned similarly.
Yes, someone consciously thrown off the balcony, losing her career due to media narratives and leaks allegedly from within D66. Vera Bergkamp's name comes up, again labeled character assassination.
So the broader point about the media is
Their perceived need for controversy just to exist, their existing right, and a tendency to target successful people, those who stick their heads boven het Meijeveld, above the mowing field. It questions the media's role. Uncovering real issues is good, but is harshly condemning individuals the right way.
And does society expect perfection now? Struggles with abnormality?
That's the reflection prompted. Are we less tolerant of difficult, maybe even slightly mad, but brilliant individuals?
And just briefly, those autonomous citizens refusing taxes, that's another kind of pushback against authority mentioned.
A very different kind, yes, but another symptom of challenging established systems.
Okay, let's tackle this final major topic from your sources, the future of Dutch pensions. A really significant, complex system change.
Very complex. And Agnes Joseph, the politician, is central to the discussion in your notes. She tried hard to stop or at least amend the new pension system law. Her approach is described as really craftsmanlike, getting deep into the details, keeping Parliament focused for weeks with probing questions, really thorough.
But she didn't succeed in stopping it.
No. In the end, parties like J21, DENK, and others sided with what's called the pension establishment. The new system went through.
And what's the change, fundamentally?
Moving away from that classic model, the stable oil tanker, less affected by short-term market swings towards something much more investment-oriented. It means pension funds need to act more like a bank department, actively playing the markets.
And not everyone's keen.
Apparently not. About a quarter of the large pension funds are reportedly not joining the new system, which suggests significant companies have serious reservations.
What are the downsides highlighted?
Well, the cost of the transition itself, the invalid, is going to be high. And the new system is just inherently more risky. Could yield more sometimes, sure, but could also yield much less or lose money when markets dip.
Characterized as more neoliberal.
Yes, letting go of those traditional anchors of the welfare state. It's even compared to those problematic investment mortgages from the past, which expose people to too much risk.
Did Agnes Joseph propose alternatives?
She argued for much more individual choice within the system, apparently, to make the increased risk more manageable for people.
And looking ahead, what challenges do pension funds face now?
Market instability is a big one. Börsen, Gun, Horlick, Hain and Beer, markets are very volatile. Potential for a crash. Plus, demands for sustainable green investments using pension money to green the economy.
Which might conflict with getting the best returns.
Potentially, yes. And even defense spending gets a mention, pensions partly funding bullets and trees, as one source starkly puts it, competing demands on that capital.
So this whole change, 15 years in the making.
Driven by tunnel vision within the policy world is the description. And implemented now, ironically, when those neoliberal ideas might feel out of time and the system faces huge instability and these conflicting pressures.
Okay, so pulling all these different threads together from your sources, what's the final takeaway, the overarching feeling?
It really seems to be a sense that we're entering, or maybe are already in, a very turbulent phase.
All these different issues, the business climate, the bureaucracy, the universities, the global shifts, the media critiques, the pension changes, they're all presented almost like symptoms, aren't they?
Yeah.
Symptoms of fundamental systems cracking.
Yes, that phrase, the system cracked, the system was cracking, comes up. And it contributes to this palpable feeling of anxiety, angst about what's next.
And the suggestion is even if there are short-term political changes, like maybe a different Dutch government this summer,
The underlying problems, the fundamental cracks in the system, they're likely to remain. Deeper issues need addressing.
it's suggested this might force a return to big questions,
Yeah.
like those from 1989.
Exactly. About East-West relations, liberalism, capitalism, the future of Europe itself. The Ukraine war is seen as a catalyst, really forcing this reassessment.
So if we connect all this to the bigger picture, the widespread issues, this feeling of systems cracking, it leaves us with a pretty big thought, doesn't it, for you, the listener, to consider.
It does. Given all this turbulence, this uncertainty, what does it actually mean to build, or even just preserve stability, whether that's in the economy or in society or just, in your own life? What does stability look like in such unstable times?